Welcome to PBS News Weekly. I'm Nick Schifrin. As we pass the 2-month mark of the war between Israel and Hamas, this week we take a look at where the conflict stands. The UN General Assembly this week overwhelmingly approved a measure calling for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The U.S. was one of 10 nations to vote against the non-binding resolution. President Biden spoke at a closed-door fundraiser and said Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu needs to change his hardline government, adding that Israel is losing global support due to what President Biden called Israel's indiscriminate bombing in Gaza.
President Biden's off-camera remarks to Democratic donors in Washington are the latest sign of increasing U.S. concern about Israel's bombing campaign in Gaza, which has killed thousands of Palestinian civilians. Bibi's got a tough decision to make, the president said of Israel's prime minister. This is the most conservative government in Israel's history, said Mr. Biden, adding that the Netanyahu-led coalition doesn't want a two-state solution, Washington's preferred outcome after the war with Hamas. The president also said Israel is starting to lose support around the world, saying of Netanyahu, "I think he has to change, and with this government in Israel is making it very difficult for him to move." Earlier, Netanyahu said Israel enjoys U.S. support for its goal of destroying Hamas, while he acknowledged differing views about a plan for after the war.
Yes, there are disputes about the day after Hamas, and I hope we will reach an agreement here as well. I will not allow that after the great sacrifice of our citizens and fighters, we bring into Gaza those who teach terrorism, support terrorism, finance terrorism.
It all comes as Israel's siege on Gaza continued in all directions.
The world's conscience is dead. No humanity or any kind of morals.
From the north, Israeli soldiers pushed their ground invasion further into the Gaza Strip, as hospitals struggle to keep up with the injured and often orphan children now in their care.
I wish the war ends and we go back to our relatives and our home, and that's it.
10-year-old Razan Shabbat lost her parents, 2 siblings, and other members of her extended family in an Israeli airstrike.
A lot of children who come here, we don't know their names, and we write unknown on their entry files until someone comes and recognizes them, including the patient you mentioned her earlier, Razan Samir Shabbat. She was unknown for days and days in the cardiac ICU until a relative came and recognized her.
But the strikes keep coming, filling streets with smoke and debris and leaving Palestinians without homes and increasingly hope.
Israel says it has launched more than 22,000 military strikes on Gaza since October the 7th. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, which is controlled by Hamas, more than 18,500 Gazans have been killed. A recent investigative report by the Israeli publication Plus 972, which describes itself as spotlighting the people who oppose Israeli occupation, and the Hebrew language outlet Local Call, finds that Israel is deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure in Gaza with the goal of increasing pressure on Hamas. We spoke to the lead reporter, investigative journalist Yuval Abraham.
Thank you for being with us. Your reporting focuses on how the IDF selects military targets and how it determines the number of civilian deaths that are acceptable. What did you find?
The military has this term called collateral damage degrees, which dictates how many civilians it is allowing soldiers to kill per strike. So even if the civilians are not the target, the amount that is allowed to be killed is known beforehand. And what I have found is that according to sources in this operation, the military has largely abandoned previous protocol. And now it is allowing soldiers, according to sources, to knowingly kill several hundred Palestinian civilians in an attempt to assassinate one senior Hamas member.
How has that changed post-October 7th? The U.S. military has a similar process, a CDE, a collateral damage estimate. And the laws of war dictate that the military advantage has to be proportionate to the civilian, the impact on civilian casualties. How does Israel make that assessment, that determination?
So in the past, according to sources, for a single assassination attempt, dozens of Palestinian civilians would be allowed to be killed. This has become 10 times or 20 times the number that was allowed in the past after October 7th.
The IDF did not immediately respond to our request for comment. Does the IDF deny or dispute anything in your reporting?
Not directly. I mean, we asked a lot of questions and we didn't get direct, specific responses. The IDF said that it is abiding by international law, that it is doing everything in its power to protect Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Again, according to sources from within the military, from within the intelligence community, this is just not true. They've spoken about completely disproportionate strikes, knowingly killing hundreds of civilians, a general atmosphere that they felt was partially motivated by revenge for the horrors of October 7th. As a matter of fact, one source said that the only thing that he felt was actually limiting the death of civilians in Gaza was international pressure, and specifically U.S. pressure.
Yuval, give us a sense, without obviously revealing your sources, who did you talk to in this reporting, and walk us through the process of how you pieced all of this together?
Yeah, so the investigation is based on conversations I've had with 7 sources from Israel's intelligence community. Some of them are current sources that are still actively taking a part in this operation. Some of them former sources that have taken part in previous operations. These are whistleblowers, so essentially they're not going to be willing to reveal their identities. I feel part of the reason why some of them spoke was that they were shocked by some of the things that they were asked to do. One source described how previously, for example, protocols in the military would say that before carrying out a strike, you would have to have a very precise pinpointing of where the target is. After October 7th, the source said, they were actually carrying out strikes based on a wide approximation, and they bombed a very wide radius, again, knowingly killing civilians. And these are sources that are in the military. They obviously care about the security of Israelis, but they felt that what was going on was unjustifiable in Gaza. And I think this is part of the reason why they were willing to speak out against it.
Investigative journalist Yuval Abraham, thank you for sharing your reporting with us.
Thank you very much.
The UN says nearly half of Gaza's population has been pushed to Rafah near the Egyptian border. And the head of the UN agency that oversees Palestinian refugees calls Gaza's humanitarian situation a, quote, living hell. To discuss the collapse of Gaza's medical infrastructure, we spoke to Avril Benoit, the executive director of Doctors Without Borders USA.
Avril Benoit, thank you so much for being here. We are seeing reports that only a third of hospitals are still open in Gaza. A UN official who just came back from southern Gaza described the region as being on the brink of total chaos. What has your own staff been reporting back to you about conditions there?
William, the conditions have been harrowing almost since the beginning, with the shortage of fuel, the shortage of medicines, of medical equipment. The constant orders to evacuate hospitals that are fully functioning and overcrowded with patients in need of care. We are seeing a lot of people coming in with catastrophic injuries, dead upon arrival in huge numbers of infections, people requiring major surgery and post-operative care that is just impossible under the current circumstances. The hospitals are full, and the medical teams are operating often with 4 or 5 people in a bed, many people having surgery at the same time. When the operating rooms are full, they're doing it in the hallways. Such a lack of anesthesia, such a lack of pain control medication, lack of bandages and basic sutures, basic supplies. Many of the hospitals are just unable to cope.
And how do your staff go about trying to triage in circumstances like that?
Well, it's a harrowing moral dilemma. You take the triage training that you receive in medical school and subsequently from conflict medicine, where you're trying to determine, okay, who can we save with the shortfalls that we have in medicines, in anesthesia, in surgical supplies, who cannot be saved. And there are a lot of people who cannot be saved. They will die of their infections. They will die of their wounds. And then you have those who are lightly injured, who will not be prioritized and are at very high risk of succumbing to what would normally be a fairly straightforward infection to deal with, a small wound, a few stitches, you send them on their way. But unfortunately, with the combination of the siege, people arriving so late because of the risk, the violence all around, we have attacks on hospitals that have now become so routine that our doctors have been killed at the bedside of patient. Just on Monday, we had a bullet pierced through the hospital from the outside. There was sniper fire, and this hospital has been surrounded by Israeli forces for many, many days now. And he was shot and injured inside the hospital while treating a patient. So between all these combination of factors of people coming in extremely wounded, the risks to healthcare workers, and all the other pressures on the medical staff, that decision of who to save, who to treat is really, I cannot express enough the heartbreak, the sense of utter failure of the medical humanitarian community because we know what to do and we just can't do it. It's impossible with the few resources, with the siege, with the constant pressures of the violence.
I mean, the IDF argues that the only reason they are approaching hospitals or fighting around hospitals is because they argue Hamas is operating inside those hospitals themselves. Have your staff seen any evidence of that?
Yeah, these are very unconvincing arguments because we're always worried about the presence of militants amidst civilians. That concerns everyone. And our staff have not seen evidence that hospitals are being used in the way that the Israeli government continues to allege to provide political cover for what can also be considered war crimes. When you attack a hospital that's fully functioning, that's full of patients, that's full of people finding refuge, civilians, families, children, there is no justification for attacking and destroying a hospital's capacity to treat people.
I mean, the UN General Assembly 2 days ago voted to call for another humanitarian ceasefire. Absent that happening, how long do you think MSF can continue operating under these conditions?
We ask ourselves that hour by hour because there are moments when we really question whether Doctors Without Borders, MSF, can continue. There may come a time if the violence and the indiscriminate violence against civilians continues to the extent that it is. We really question how long we can hang on, and we don't want to leave. We would like to be able to scale up. People have a right to humanitarian assistance. And because of the conduct of the war, this indiscriminate violence, the siege, it's imperative that we get a ceasefire so that at the very least, we can start giving civilians an opportunity to survive this horror.
All right, Avril Benoit of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
In recent days, the Biden administration has pressed Israel to reduce civilian casualties and allow the Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza after the war. That's created a public rift between the U.S. and Netanyahu. To understand why, we spoke to Natan Sachs, the director of the Brookings Institution's Center for Middle East Policy.
So what's behind this apparent public rift between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Well, there are both substantive differences between the two parties and also political ones. Substantively, the president and the prime minister see quite differently, especially the day after the ground operation in the Gaza Strip. We're looking at probably the last few weeks of this phase of the ground operation, and what follows has been described very differently by the two leaders. President Biden has said no Hamas ruling the Gaza Strip after the war, but also no Israeli reoccupation of the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu, on the other hand, has described an indefinite Israeli security overall responsibility in the Gaza Strip, believing that no other force, international or multinational, would have the wherewithal and they would agree to pay the price to conduct counterinsurgency in the Gaza Strip. He's probably right in this assessment. But there's also other differences. The president sees a major role for the Palestinian Authority that currently controls parts of the West Bank, at least rejuvenated, reformed, but then entering into the Gaza Strip as the main Palestinian force there. Netanyahu has staked out a position that would be unacceptable, and there would be no future, at least for this current form of the Palestinian Authority, in the Gaza Strip. That's a major difference between the two. There's also politics involved. Biden has a lot of pressure domestically and internationally and sees a need to make clear that he's been using not only his love for Israel, but also his pressure, the leverage that he's gained by showing this close affinity to Israel. And Netanyahu is struggling for his political future himself. He's now trailing badly in the polls against the presumptive winner would be Benny Gantz, who's currently in the coalition, but only temporarily. And he's trying to stake out a position that would differentiate between him and Benny Gantz, in particular on the question of the Palestinian Authority and whether there might be a Palestinian state and a two-state solution down the road, something Netanyahu is hinting that he is the only one who would prevent, as most Israelis are very fearful of it today, and hinting that Benny Gantz perhaps would not be able to prevent it.
Will this pressure from the United States from President Biden have any effect on Prime Minister Netanyahu?
It's a mixed bag there. On the one hand, Netanyahu is answering to an Israeli public that is still very much traumatized by October 7th. It is reliving the trauma, it is feeling it, talking about it incessantly daily, and has very little patience for concessions to Palestinians. On the other hand, President Biden stood by Israel in a way that really moved Israeli hearts and minds immediately after October 7th. And that gives him a lot of cachet, a lot of leverage in Israel. So Netanyahu will voice very strong public rhetoric against any pressure, but in private and in practice, he often follows suit in terms of what the American administration wants. So Biden has a lot of sway in Israel, and he's already used a lot of it in ways that some of them have not been public. But there is a limit to it. The Israeli public and the Israeli elites see it as a national interest now, national imperative to bring down Hamas. And so that in between there is where Biden has leverage.
And is there a real threat? Do you think that U.S. support could change, could go down, or maybe have strings attached, restrictions attached to it?
I don't expect the fundamental support from President Biden to change. He clearly believes firmly in the main goal, which is that Hamas, after October 7th, cannot be allowed to rule a statelet neighboring Israel or any other country. And in that, he is in full agreement with the Israelis. But we can see, and we have already seen, a change in the American position that would give full support to the Israeli operation, including the supply of munitions, the very crucial supply of munitions.
Natan Sachs of the Brookings Institution Center for Middle East Policy, thank you very much.
Thank you.
In the U.S., administrators at Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania are facing intense pressure after they appeared before a congressional committee last week looking into anti-Semitism on college campuses. Harvard University's board ultimately united behind its president, Claudine Gay, saying she should remain in her position despite calls for her resignation.
Gay, MIT President Sally Kornbluth, and now outgoing University of Pennsylvania President Liz McGill came under fire last week for their testimony in a House hearing on rising anti-Semitism on their campuses. On Friday, Gay apologized for her remarks to the Harvard Crimson, saying, "Calls for violence or genocide against the Jewish community or any religious or ethnic group are vile. They have no place at Harvard, and those who threaten our Jewish students will be held to account." The flashpoint of last Tuesday's hearing, a heated line of questioning from Republican Representative Elise Stefanik, who herself has been criticized for not calling out anti-Semitism in her own party.
And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
Stefanik was referring to slogans that have been chanted at pro-Palestinian rallies on campus, such as "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." That phrase, adopted by Hamas, is seen by some as a call for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jewish people. Others say it's a decades-old rallying call for a state where all Palestinians can live freely alongside Israelis.
I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
The day after the hearing, Rabbi David Wolpe stepped down from the university's Anti-Semitism Advisory Committee.
I felt as though there was a profound disconnect between the attitude of the presidents and my perception of the seriousness of the situation.
Wolpe, a visiting scholar at Harvard's Divinity School, resigned over what he considers inaction by the university to confront anti-Semitism.
Some of the things that it seemed to me Harvard needed to do almost immediately were to enforce the existing rules against harassment and bullying and so on more expeditiously, that is, more immediately than they were doing it, to undertake a major education campaign about Judaism, anti-Semitism, Jewish history.
More than 600 faculty signed a letter saying Harvard should not cave to political pressure. Steven Pinker, a professor of psychology, didn't sign the letter, but said Gay's firing would not solve the problem.
The reason that I don't think should be called on to resign is that I think the problems run much deeper and they should be addressed directly rather than through a sacrificial scapegoat. I think that Harvard and American universities in general need a clear and conspicuous policy on free speech so they don't selectively squelch speech. Reprehensible speech should be answered by more speech, by being refuted, not by being criminalized.
At University of Pennsylvania, the consequences were swift. On Saturday, University President Liz McGill announced her resignation after donors, politicians, and some students called for her ouster. Days before, she issued a public apology.
I want to be clear. A call for genocide of Jewish people is threatening. Deeply so. In my view, it would be harassment or intimidation.
McGill's testimony last week was similar to Gay's. Claire Finkelstein is a professor of law and philosophy at UPenn. She said while McGill is a brilliant person, her testimony was disastrous.
I'm not calling for a restriction of criticisms of Israel or criticisms of Hamas or what have you. Political speech and the ability to engage in it. But what has gotten out of hand is the idea that free speech on campus has to include such a level of openness to any kind of speech that even the worst threats and harassment should be protected.
Before McGill's resignation, more than 70 members of Congress, all but 3 of whom were Republican, signed a letter demanding the 3 presidents step aside. They said the testimony lacked moral clarity and illuminated the problematic double standards and dehumanization of Jewish communities. Meanwhile, some progressive members, including the only Palestinian American in Congress, Rashida Tlaib, say allegations of anti-Semitism are being weaponized to silence legitimate criticisms of Israel.
Americans have a right to speak up. Americans have a right to the institutions they work at or the people that represent them to say, look, this is my opinion. I believe you should support X, Y, and Z.
House Republicans have opened an investigation into the 3 universities, and more than a dozen Democratic lawmakers asked schools to review and update their policies. And at MIT, President Sally Kornbluth has not apologized, receiving support from her university's governing board. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Laura Barone-Lopez.
The Jewish community celebrated Hanukkah this week, but for many, the holiday has been tempered by the ongoing war and fears of anti-Semitism closer to home. We spoke to people across the U.S. about what Hanukkah means to them and if they celebrated differently this year.
I'm Rebecca Lowen.
My name is David Berenson, and I'm from the Cleveland area.
I'm Rabbi Jill Perlman, and I serve as the senior rabbi at Temple Isaiah in Lafayette, California.
My name is Gadi Peleg, and I'm the founder and owner of Bread's Bakery in New York City.
My name is Mark Baker. I'm the president and CEO of Combined Jewish Philanthropies. The Hanukkah holiday feels incredibly poignant and in some ways too relevant this year. Hanukkah, first and foremost, is a story about resistance. It's about our willingness to stand up and fight against people who would try to do us harm. And it's a story about the courage to overcome.
Certainly in our synagogue, and I know in synagogues across the country, we'll be holding close the over 130 hostages that are still being held in Gaza. We are hoping and praying for peace in the region and that all who are suffering, the innocent who are suffering in Gaza, in Israel, that suffering is able to come to an end and we're able to find a solution that will be one in which all will ultimately be at peace.
I run a Jewish-focused lifestyle blog. So I recently had a post take off on Instagram about how to celebrate in this year, given everything that's going on, both in the Middle East, again, and here at home with the rise of anti-Semitism.
Moses said it best. I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Oh, that you would choose life so that you and your children may live. So go ahead and host, celebrate, decorate, bake cupcakes with tiny potatoes on them. Whatever you do, just don't do it lightly.
So I think one reason why the video went viral is that people within the Jewish community are looking for that permission to resume normal life and to celebrate this holiday that we all love so much, and to do it with some joy in our hearts.
It is, of course, the celebration of the miracle of the oil, and that miracle is celebrated by eating sufganiyot, that are jelly donuts, and latkes. We are seeing a huge demand for all of our Hanukkah items as people are eager to celebrate this holiday, which has particular importance and particular meaning this year.
We need to come together as a community and publicly to say we're proud of who we are, and nothing's going to get in the way of us celebrating our tradition and our past and our stories.
We have family coming in from out of town that we don't always have around Hanukkah. I don't know what to anticipate with our family discussions this year. I'm kind of looking forward to it, even though it may be challenging at a time, because you get 10 people together in a room and you get 15 different perspectives.
We can hold multiple emotions and multiple reactions to what is happening at the same time. There is sadness and even some despair over the ongoing war in Israel and in Gaza. But we're also going to continue to hold on to hope and make sure that we are finding the joy of this holiday and the joy of just what it means to be alive each and every day.
And that's PBS News Weekly. Thanks so much for watching.